Well, today we come once again to our Lenten series, a series we're calling Finding God. Some of you may be tackling this for the first time. And if so, again, if some things resonate with you and you think about seeking and finding God in your everyday life, I encourage you, go back and listen into where we've been. But having talked in this series so far about our need to seek out and find God in the midst of our relationships, in the midst of creation, think about that. In the midst of our wilderness experience, some of our most difficult times, in the midst of our times in quiet, as Josh led us to last week, to seek and find God in the midst of kind of all of those things, today we turn our attention to our culture. In other words, today we want to talk about how we are to seek and find God in our culture. I think it's important for us to start off with a clear definition of what we mean by culture so that we're on the same page. And so here's how we're defining this today. Here's how we're defining this today. Culture is the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution, organization, or group. Again, really hear those four things that are emphasized here. Attitudes and values and goals and practices, because those are things that definitely do define in so many ways what a culture truly is. If we were to take a moment, I would divide you up into groups, maybe just two, but let's say three or four. If I were to divide you up into groups, when people get really nervous, people at home are saying, I'm glad I worship online, right? If I were to divide you up, if is the word here, right? If I were to divide you up and say, hey, talk about culture a bit. One, I may not get another word in today, right? Two, maybe at the very least, y'all would talk for a while. And why is that? Because we do think about culture. We do talk about culture. And though we can't narrow it down to just a few things, what are some of the things that naturally come to mind when we think about our culture, if we want to look at it in a broad sense? Sometimes what comes to mind focuses on movies, music. Sometimes when we think culture, we think entertainment. We just think of media. We think of all of that. Sometimes when we think of culture, if we really give our culture a chance, we might, in a positive sense, be led to altruism, right? We might see within our culture, from a positive perspective, people who truly do want to care for others. I love it even when I'm on good old ESPN and I see, people serving others, and it's like, yeah, that is a part of our culture. It is. When my son and I were on a trip a week ago, and one of the neat things about being on a cruise is you do have the chance to meet people from all over the world, right? So we're on a trip where we're out in the midst of the water swimming, the ocean swimming, and there are these little platforms periodically. We climb up on the platform. There's another gentleman there, so we get to talking a little bit. From Australia. Now, it's always interesting what people will say, so I'll ask you all the same thing. So what do you think I said to him first? Now, again, we get up on the platform, we start talking to him. What are some of the first words I say to him? Some of you are thinking g'day, right? But what I started with was, come on, you would have been the same place. So, are you from England, right? We're going to always assume that. We're not going to go down the Australia path. So, he still talks to us after that. But here's what was really, really interesting. And I think it's just perfect for what we're dealing with today, because we've got to hear this. One of the things that he offered up immediately when we began to talk about our two countries, one of the things he talked about immediately was this, that he found Americans, unlike his fellow Aussies, and again, these are his words, he said that he found Americans to be quite friendly and quite helpful. Hear that again. He said that he found Americans to be quite friendly and quite helpful. And I really do think by saying that, what was he talking about? He was talking about the differences between our two cultures. So when we think about our culture, we might think about music, we might think about movies, we might think in a very positive way about altruism, Americans caring for each other. Or we might think, and we need to be willing to go here from time to time too, we might look at our culture and say, yeah, there are some pretty negative things there as well, some things that make us sad, still some racism in our culture today. But wherever we might end up when we start talking culture, wherever we might end up, here's what we got to understand. In so many ways, God is in the midst of all of it, right? God is in every nook and cranny of the culture in which we live. You believe that, don't you? And so that's what we want to talk about today. Now, Richard Niebuhr, in his book, Christ in Culture, in that book, Niebuhr tells us that for him, there are really 4 ways that you can relate to culture. And you might say, gosh, there got to be more than 4. But I do think in so many ways, these encapsulate all of them. So think about how these might resonate for you. He says there are 4 ways you can relate to culture. First off, he says, when it comes to culture, we can relate to it by being against it, right? First off, you can relate to culture by kind of hating it, by kind of trying to completely separate yourself from it. And let me just say, because I do think this goes against everything Jesus ever taught us about how we are to relate to the world around us, because I think this goes against everything he taught us, everything he showed us. Because of that, with this first thought, let me just say this. When you look back a little bit in history, when you look at what's going on even in our world today, you find so many so-called Christian groups who really do only see the negative in our culture. Meaning all they seek out is what is bad in the world so that they can find a way to stand against it, instead of doing this, looking for everything that's good in this world so that they can create partnerships with that goodness. Because even when that goodness isn't springing out of a church, what do we know about every good thing? It comes from God, right? So God's in the midst of that. Honestly, I find myself in conversations all the time where I'm focused on that very thing. I'm trying to point out to a Christian of all people, trying to point out to them how much good there really is in our world today, so that we might then begin to talk about how we need to create partnerships where we find that good. The second way Niebuhr says we can relate to culture is this. We can view Christ as a Christ of culture. Or we can interpret Christ through the lens of culture, meaning as culture is constantly changing, and it does, doesn't it? As culture is constantly changing, if we look at Christ and culture in this way, then our view of Christ is going to constantly be changing, right? Now, what do we know to be true? Christ never changes, right? Who he is for us never changes. So here's another thing we've got to steer clear of. When we begin to interpret Christ as a Christ of culture, then our view of Christ is going to change. As culture changes, not good either. So we don't want to stand against culture, call it pure evil. We don't want to interpret Christ through the lens of culture. So there's a third approach that Niebuhr says we can bring to culture. We also can think of Christ as above it, right? Christ as above culture. And that doesn't mean so much that we're standing against culture. It simply means that we're kind of just, ignoring it, not calling it evil, but just kind of setting it aside, because our entire focus is not on where is God in my culture, right? Our entire focus with this third thought is, come on, Jesus, wipe this culture away with the new kingdom you make possible. Nothing wrong with that, right? A lot of people think, and I hope today is the day he returns, right? I can't wait till the kingdom of God takes over. And yet, if Jesus calls us to live in our world today, to be disciples of his in our world today, we also don't want to kind of set it aside, even if it's not looking at it as evil, but just thinking, oh, but God, I want your kingdom to come. What do we know about his kingdom coming and what Jesus calls us to? We're to be a part of making that happen, right? Drawing the world into that. So those are three ways he says we can relate to culture. But then we have a fourth. And this is the way he embraces. It's the way I want you to embrace. And it's important for us to embrace this particular approach to culture because this is the one that is the most biblical. Fourthly, he says this: we can also see Christ as a transformer of culture. You don't have to see something as evil to say, I want to engage it and make it better, right? We also can look at, and this is the way we need to look at Christ in culture, we can also see Christ as a transformer of culture. And what that means for us, if we're willing to lean toward this understanding, what that means for us is this: anytime we are caught up in the midst of culture, rather than judging it, rather than condemning it, rather than just kind of avoiding it, we too need to always approach culture with an eye toward this very thing. How can I be an agent, his agent, of transformation in the midst of all that is around me beyond these walls, beyond this time? Now, one of the very best examples of that comes down to the Apostle Paul. I mean, this is how he saw himself as one who was partnering with Christ in order to transform culture for the better, bit by bit. Think of him reaching out to Gentiles. To flesh that out a bit more, how he is such a beautiful picture of this. Let me just set a stage for this. We're going to spend some time in the book of Acts chapter 17. So let me set a stage for this. At this point in his ministry, Paul is traveling through present-day Greece. He's just arrived in Athens, which at that time is kind of a city in decline, but still a center for academic learning. Coach would tell you after the national championship, Athens is definitely not a city in decline, but I would say, no. Not talking about Athens, Georgia. We're talking about, right, Athens, Greece. I got nothing from this group. I said it a different way at 8 o'clock, Coach, but I knew I couldn't say it that way at this service. I was catering the Gators at that service. You back with me? Okay. He comes to present-day Greece, having just arrived in Athens, city in decline, but still this major center for academic learning. With that as a backdrop, here's verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, for Silas, for Timothy, he's waiting for them. He was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Now, we're going to get into this more deeply, so I hate to interrupt myself as I read through this with you, but I just got to say, do you know how many of us, when we walk into a space like that and we are greatly distressed by what we see, maybe we're infuriated by what we see, we're going to take off, right? We're going to condemn. We're going to say, that's a bunch of hopeless people, right? We who are called by Christ to bring the gospel into every nook and cranny. It's not what Paul does, thank goodness, and so let's learn from him. He was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue, and that's always where Paul would start with conversations like this, in the synagogue. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. And I like that addition to God-fearing Greeks and Jews, and then just anybody within listening distance, right? Verse 18, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and those were two of the dominant philosophies of that day. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Some of them ask, what is this babbler trying to say? And in that day, that term would refer to someone they felt like had no clear, coherent thought, someone who was just kind of grabbing on to truths from here and there. Some of them ask, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Verse 19. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, The Areopagus was really the highest legislative council in ancient Athens. They took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. We might say he must be doing pretty well with making that connection because he's getting more and more of an audience. They bring him there where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears. We want to know what those things mean." Now, I share all this as a way of setting up what comes next. Because what comes next in this very academic environment, what comes next is Paul attempting to engage this culture fully with what? With the good news of Jesus Christ. And I think what we can most learn from him here when we are looking for God in the midst of culture, when we're trying to point others to God in the midst of our culture, I think one of the most important things we can learn from him here is this: how to ask the right questions of culture. When we're trying to find God in the midst of culture, point others to God in the midst of our world today, especially if they don't know him yet, a key is always going to be this: asking the right questions as we approach culture. So that's what we want to talk about today. Guys, here's the first thing we need to ask when we begin to engage culture. When it comes to some of the things that we find in our lives, when it comes to some of the things that we find in culture, things that mean a great deal to us, things that mean a great deal to others, when it comes to those things, what really is at their center? What do they really mean? What do they really represent? Because again, not talking about the things we might bring to it out of our Christian faith. I'm just talking about things that are familiar to people. First off, we've got to ask, okay, what are some of the most meaningful things already in culture? And then as we come to terms with what those are, then we got to ask the question, okay, God, how might we use some of those things at times in ways that reveal you to those around us who don't know you? On June 4th, 1783, at the market square of a French village not far from Paris, the story goes that a smoky bonfire on a raised platform was fed by wet straw, old wool rags. Tethered above, straining its lines, was a huge bag 33 feet in diameter. In the presence of, as the story goes, a respectable assembly and a great many other people. I guess that's to say, it really happened, right? Accompanied by great cheering, the balloon was cut from its moorings and set free to rise majestically into the noon sky. 6,000 feet into the air it went, the first public ascent of a balloon and the first step in the history of human flight. It came to earth several miles away in a field where it was promptly attacked by pitchfork waving peasants and torn to pieces as an instrument of evil. Guys, when Paul came to Athens, first thing he noticed was a city full of idols, right? And no doubt that must have really, really bothered him. And yet notice this: instead of going after those idols like we might have, instead of going after those idols with a pitchfork, so to speak, immediately calling them evil, or instead of starting with, I'm not even going to say another word to you unless you remove all these idols, right? You've been there, haven't you? Instead of starting there, what does Paul do? He does this. He says this, verse 22. Love this. Think about what he's experiencing. He says this: Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, you ready?" We would say, "You're crazy, you're bad," right? He says, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious," right? That's not false, is it? Making that connection with them. What's he saying to them? He's saying it's obvious that you have a very soft spot for God because you've got so many of them, right? And all he's trying to do with those opening thoughts is to look for common ground. Do you know how many times, and it happens to us, but man, sometimes Christianity in our world today, it's almost like this. They think this is their greatest weapon to shut down conversation as quick as they can, right? You're not looking for common ground. They're not looking for, I think this person kind of believes this way. Let's see if at least I can find common ground and we can talk. Here's Paul showing us so clearly, we got to find common ground in our world that we might then have these kinds of conversations. So that's what he does, allows for conversation by approaching things in this way. Let's continue, verse 23. For as I walked around, he said, I can see you are men of religion. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Beautiful part of the story. Now, what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, but he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Again, what is Paul doing here? He's calling the Athenians to continue to worship, yes, but to now at least consider looking for the one true God, that eventually they may begin to worship him and him alone. Again, a great question for us to ask periodically is this: when we look at our culture, what do we already see in our culture that brings great meaning to people's lives? What do we already see in our culture like that might provide an opening to a conversation? And as we see that, we then need to ask, how might we begin to use this for good? I think one of the greatest examples of this over the last several decades relates to music, and especially for this service. I think this will make a whole lot of sense. Sometimes we forget this. I don't know about you, but there are times when I'm in this moment, I think this is how life always was. Not true. We go back 50 years, and while we might have had some gospel that was similar to hymns, things like that, but it brought some wonderful elements of the Christian faith in, for the most part, decades ago, boy, you only brought into the house of worship hymns, classical music, all of that, right? Imagine someone at that time being willing to at least pose the question, okay, what means so much to people, maybe especially younger people in our world today? What speaks into their hearts, whether we like what it's saying or not? What is something that is transcendent, that means so much to people? Oh, it's music, Think of several decades ago, people being willing to ask that question and then being willing to say this. So I wonder how maybe we could take the music of this day, bring our faith to it, transform it in some key ways so that it might pull people in. The music already has great meaning. How might we use it? Because they were willing to start a movement that moved us from condemnation to use for God's will and purpose. Because they were willing to kind of create a movement that moved us from condemnation to, as we used these words earlier, common ground. That movement began the creation of a music industry that today touches the lives of millions and millions and millions of people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. You know how easy it would have been for someone to say, let's just keep on doing what we've always done? Versus saying, man, there's power in music. Is there a way, if we bring Christ in touch with it, might be transformed? Were you transformed? First 3 songs we shared together today, I was, and that's what it can do for us as it's been touched. There are other things that can function in the same way, but I think music is one that especially we can see it, can't we? First question to ask when we come at culture, rather than condemning it, we begin to engage it with Christ's help. First question to ask is, what's already there that is very meaningful? How might it be used to open people's eyes to God? But then here's a second question Paul says we need to bring to culture as well. As we look around us in our world today, where do we see God already at work? Where do we see God already at work? And I want to say this again because we can get so narrow-minded. I'm not talking where do we see God at work through things churches are doing only, right? And where do we see God at work in our world today? And if we'll point people to those things, those who don't know Christ, those who don't have a walk with God, how might that also lead people to say, there is a God who's near me. How does he want to be a part of my life? How might I seek and find him? Paul writes this in verse 28, for in him we live and move and have our being, trying to point them to the one true God. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. And guys, actually, both of those quotes are quotes from Greek literature. Literature that his listeners would have been very familiar with. And so again, here is Paul in an effort to teach them more about the one true God. Here is Paul starting with something they're comfortable with, starting with some words from their own culture that he might say in so many ways, I'm not bringing you anything foreign, I'm not bringing you anything new. These truths of God are already right here. Again, what's he doing that we need to always try to do? He's trying to connect the dots for them, showing them how God is already with them so that they might more and more seek him out. And in the end, it's wonderful to focus on the result then. In the end, the beautiful thing is this, because he doesn't leave them as soon as he sees the idols, because he doesn't beat them up with his faith, but instead seeks out common ground and conversation, what we're called to do. Because he's willing to do that, here's the result. Verse 34, a few men became followers of Paul and believed, followers of Christ as well. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. And of all the verses we've looked at today, perhaps this one is the most important. Being reminded in the end, because he dealt with their culture in this way, what happened? Many people came to Christ.